A 999 special Missing in Action Tuesday at 9:30 on BBC One.
This is BBC One. Now the news with Jill Dando. Good morning. John Major will see the Queen within the next hour to tender his resignation as Prime Minister. The Conservatives suffered their worst election defeat in 150 years. 6 cabinet ministers lost their seats, including the Defence Secretary Michael Portillo and the Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind. With just a few results to come, Labour are on course for a Commons majority of 179, the best result in their history. And the Liberal Democrats have just won St Ives.
Mr Major returned to Downing Street this morning for the last time, his party broken by the Labour landslide. At the rear of number 10, the removal men were already waiting, after a night where Tory despair turned to disbelief as a series of high-profile Conservatives were ousted. The Foreign Secretary, Malcolm Rifkind, the Trade Secretary, Ian Lang, the Scottish Secretary, Michael Forsyth, all lost their seats, part of a Tory wipeout north of the border. But perhaps the biggest shock was Michael Portillo's defeat in what was thought a safe seat. And David Mellor was jeered by the referendum party after their votes helped oust him.
Is a derisory total. The referendum party is dead in the water.
And in Tatton, Martin Bell, the candidate in the white suit, romped home against Neil Hamilton, former MP embroiled in the Cash for Questions affair.
I believe you have lit a beacon which will shed light in some dark corners and illuminate the Mother of Parliaments itself.
At Tory headquarters, as the scale of the defeat sank in, there was an air of bewilderment. The pollsters, this time, had been proved right.
Tonight we have suffered a very bad defeat. Let us not pretend to ourselves it was anything other than what it was. Unless we accept it for what it was and look at it, we will be less able to put it right.
The contrast with Labour could not have been more marked. They'd waited 18 years for this party.
A new dawn has broken, has it not? And it is wonderful. We always said that if we had the courage to change, then we could do it, and we did it.
The Liberal Democrats also enjoyed a record night, doubling the number of their seats.
And now today's other news. A man who killed 4 people has arrived back in Britain following his release from prison in Australia. Archie McCafferty, who emigrated from Glasgow at the age of 10, flew into Heathrow this morning after losing his appeal to remain in Australia. Firefighters in Essex have gone on strike again in their dispute over the County Council's budget cuts. Green Goddess Appliances will provide emergency cover during the 9-hour stoppage. Zaire's President Mobutu is due to hold peace talks today with the rebel leader Laurent Kabila. Kabila, who meets the president on a South African warship, says he'll only discuss the transfer of power. And that's it for now. More news at midday.
Good morning to you. It's another day of hot sunshine across the bulk of the country, the exception really being the far north of Scotland, where it is colder, it's cloudy, and there's some spots of rain coming out of that thick cloud as well. If anything, it'll move a little bit further south later in the afternoon, with clearer weather, in fact sunny weather, returning across Shetland and then Orkney. But this strong sunshine means 35 minutes before you start to burn, and we're looking at temperatures round about 25 degrees this afternoon in many places, and that's 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Now tonight you'll find some of that patchy rain moving further south across Scotland, temperatures typically 7 to 9 degrees, and then the signs of a breakdown for the weekend, because we are going to see some showery bursts of rain moving up towards the Isles of Scilly, some heavy bursts in there with some thunder now being reported out in the Atlantic, some showers then for the southwest tomorrow, still plenty of warm sunshine about, some rain in eastern Scotland.
You have 30 seconds against the clock to look at the antiques on this table. One of them is worth over £1,000. Can you guess which one it is? Look closely. Is it this one, or this one? Have you got it yet? Your time is nearly up. Find out if you're right in the first of a new series of The Great Antiques Hunt. Starts Sunday at 7:25 on BBC One.
Now on BBC One, we return to Election 97.
And we now pick up the story that Peter Snow was telling a moment ago of what people want from the new Labour government. We join Nisha Pillay, who's in the Glaxo Wellcome factory in Stevenage. Nisha.
Yes, David, I'm actually in Glaxo Wellcome's research laboratories here in Stevenage, and I've got a number of people with me who work in and around Stevenage, and I'm going to start off with a teacher, Glenn Williams. Glenn, teachers must have very high expectations now of what Labour will deliver.
Well, absolutely delighted with this victory. What it means to us is that we think we now have a government we can actually work with, and not a government we're in continual tension with.
You'll be looking for a lot of extra spending, though, won't you?
I think we still have to be patient in terms of resources. We like what we hear about reducing class sizes and doing away with this bureaucratic nursery arrangement that they have, that the Tories had, but we think that the longer term is the perspective we need to take on this one. Gordon Brown has made it quite clear that resources will not be there for at least 2 years. So we have to think in the longer term as well.
Aren't there going to be frustrations that with this huge mandate, economic policy isn't going to change and the money won't be available despite the promises?
Of course it's frustrating, and it'll take a long time for classes to diminish in size, but at the same time I think this victory is a great psychological leap as far as the profession is concerned, and we think now that we have a government that's in sympathy with our aims and objectives, and I think we could form a partnership with David Dimbleby.
Brian Hall, you're the leader of Stevenage Council here. You must have a long list of demands for Tony Blair.
Not demands, no. I hope to see a new deal for local government under New Labour, if you don't mind a slogan. In particular, there are 3 areas where they have promised that there will be changes. In particular, the cap-in limits, we hope to see those removed.
Freedom to set your own rates.
Freedom to set our own rate. We would like to see the business rate returned back to the community.
What about housing?
And
That's
in
a
housing,
priority,
we would dearly like to see our housing receipts unfrozen, so we can actually start building houses and homes for people that need them.
Will it happen in a hurry, though, in practice? The £6 billion of frozen council house sale receipts, won't there be rationing in practice?
I'm sure in practice there will be. I cannot conceive that the construction industry could take that amount of work on immediately. So I'm sure there'll be some rationing, and I'm sure to some extent we first come, first served, and to that end, in Stevenage, we have a scheme ready to go forward already.
And if there is rationing, how are Labour councils up and down the world, the country, going to take it?
Oh, they'll take it. I mean, they'll accept, I'm sure, that there's got to be, resources are going to be rationed, and there's got to be some element of rationing in whatever is done.
So no new dawn in a hurry, then?
No. I believe that most councils, in fact I believe most people, regard this government as a new beginning. It's not an end in itself, it's a new beginning, and I'm hoping that we will build on the new beginning in the years ahead to see the sort of policies in this country that the people really want to see in place. And I think that's why they voted Labour in with that huge majority.
I want to bring in Dr. Matthew Skingle. You work here at Glaxo Wellcome and supervise a number of research projects with universities. What is Glaxo Wellcome looking to see? What changes from a new Labour government?
I do indeed. It's Malcolm Skingle. What we've seen over the last couple of years is a big decline in the amount of funding which has been going to university laboratories performing research. And we put a lot of money into academic research. We put more than £10 million every year into academic collaborations. And what we see is a decline of the science base, such that the laboratories are now very run down and they're in a state of disrepair, such they're using obsolete equipment, which isn't used by the scientists here, using the state-of-the-art equipment. And it's such that when the graduates and postdocs actually leave the university now and come to work in this environment, we have to start with their training again.
But do you have any confidence that Tony Blair will put any more money into the scientific base?
Well, they've certainly been making the right noises. I mean, Adam Ingram, the Shadow Minister of Science, has been saying that he wants to increase the awareness of the science base, and he has also been saying that the Tories should indeed have put more money into the science base. So if he doesn't come up with the money now, really he's going against what he said previously.
Okay. Stelio Stefano, you represent businessmen, a leading light in the local CBI here. With such a mandate, Labour can be as radical as it wants to be. Are you concerned?
No, we're not concerned at the CBI because we're there to work with whichever government the electorate put into power. Our job really is to represent the needs of business, and we have a stable set of economic factors at the moment. We have had for a couple of years now, and that's good for business. It means we're able to plan ahead,
But with such a solid majority, Labour can comprehensively rewrite union legislation, for instance. Business isn't going to be too pleased about that.
Well, I don't think that the present Labour government, the new Labour government, would contemplate doing that. I think they would recognise, I hope they would recognise, and certainly at the CBI we would be reminding them that it's very important to encourage business to invest in skills and to invest in equipment and to create the wealth that we all need in order to pay for all the things we need in our society. We won't get it any other way other than earning it, and that means business and the government working together to create the right sort of economy so that we can afford everything we need.
Tony Blair has been talking the language of Thatcherism very successfully. Are you convinced, though, that they actually understand enterprise and understand the needs of business?
From the discussions the CBI has been having, we believe that there is a real understanding of what business needs. I think with any government, only time will tell. That's the honest answer. The proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, and we look forward to working with the government in order to ensure that the correct...
There we must leave it. Thanks very much for joining me, gentlemen. Back to you, David.
Nisha Pillay in Stevenage. The door of number 10 is guarded at the moment, and we're waiting for the Prime Minister to come out, and he's going to speak there in Downing Street before he goes off to the Palace. So we'll bring you that as soon as we have it. Robin Oakley, in the meantime, has been talking to him, Robin, or been hearing what his views are?
I haven't actually been speaking to Mr. Major, I'm afraid, David, but I've been talking to some of his close allies, and they believe that while Mr. Major was initially a little bit inclined to depart rapidly after a bad defeat, they now feel he's being talked around very much to the view that he would carry on as leader until July. But what they're expecting him to do is to not make any firm announcement on that. I may be confounded very rapidly if he comes out into the street shortly, because at an emotional time like this, decisions can sometimes be made very quickly. But what they're expecting is that he'll go home to Great Stewkley over the weekend, and that we'll get an announcement perhaps on Sunday or perhaps on Monday about his intentions in the leadership. But one thing I understand he really doesn't want to do is to go on as far as this year's party conference, turning that into a beauty contest for the potential contenders for the crown.
In whose interest is it to have this delay?
Well, I think it's in the interests of most of the potential contenders, except John Redwood, who, from the moment that he challenged Mr. Major unsuccessfully in 1995, has had a couple of years virtually in opposition already, free from the constraints of cabinet collective responsibility. He's been able to make his pitch, set out a distinctive line, so he's got a bit of a head start over some of the others at the moment. And of course, although Mr. Major is a very reasonable and friendly man, he's not an easy forgiver, and I don't think he would want to do anything that particularly helped Mr. Redwood. And I think he also does take the view that because so many of his top people in the party are inexperienced at the arts of opposition, which are very different to the arts of being in government, that he thinks they need time to display their wares to their new electorate of Conservative MPs, and those MPs need time to get to know the contenders before the decision is made on his successor.
Robin Oakley, thank you very much. Down at Downing Street, the Prime Ministerial car is waiting outside number 10 to take John Major to the Palace. The microphone set up just behind it there in the shadow where we expect him to come and speak, and we'll go to that as soon as he gets there. In the meantime, let's have a quick look, Peter, at the results.
And here's the historic moment that we're celebrating in the background to those trips to the Palace. Labour on 417 seats. Look how they've coloured the map red there in many, many more areas than they had before. 145 up on last time. Record number of Labour MPs. The Tories down to their lowest since 1906. The Liberal Democrats doubling their parliamentary representation. Here are the gains flashing now. Look at Labour massively coming back. Liberal Democrats moving into places like Taunton, the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth South, right the way along the south coast there, places like Lewis and Eastbourne. And Scotland, no Tories in Scotland or Wales. Records created tonight, records tumbling one after the other. Just one of them, here are the number of Labour seats that Clem Attlee had in 1945, 393. Harold Wilson in 1966 had 364 Labour MPs. Neither of them got as far as 400. Tony Blair did. He has a total of 419 Labour MPs behind him in the House of Commons, probably opposite him as well. There's so many of them, they're on the opposition benches. And finally then, the picture that reminds us just what an era has come to an end after 18 years of Tory rule. There she is with her majority of 44 when she beat Jim Callaghan. Baroness Thatcher, she is now, 1983, that huge majority of 144, the high tide of Thatcherism lasted for 4 years till 1987, when she was back again with a majority of 102. And then John Major surprised many by winning the election of 1992 with a majority of 21. He survived a whole 5 years, but now he's gone. And conclusively, 1997, Tony Blair with a majority of 179.
Thank you, Peter. Alan Beath has held on to his seat, Berwick-on-Tweed, and that's for the Liberal Democrats, of course. He's deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats. He's safely in. And now Jeremy Paxman has been joined by some plutocratic supporters of the Labour Party. Jeremy.
I think they'd be jolly offended to be called plutocrats, David. They're business people. Chris Writer, Chris Liss, Terence Conran, and Lucy Heller, who runs Verso. When Tony Blair says he's the party of business now, why do you believe him?
Well, I do believe him. I think he's very genuinely concerned about moving the country forward. And there's a lot of aspects that he's concerned about, especially developing new businesses and encouraging new entrepreneurs to have the resource and the ability to develop businesses for the future.
So you just think he's had some kind of Damascus Road conversion, do you?
I think, I do, yes. I think, not a conversion, but I think he's genuinely very concerned about things like that.
Given, although he opposed every privatisation that went through under the Tories?
Well, yes.
Terence Conran, why do you find him plausible?
Because he listens to people in business. He wants to talk to us. He asks the right questions and considers the answers that we give him.
Okay, a cynic might say, everything is business to you guys. You recognise that Tony Blair was going to win this election, and you made a strategic alliance, along with lots of other people like Richard Branson. Is that true?
Absolutely not in my case. Maybe in Richard's case. But
yeah, exactly. Maybe in Richard's case.
I have been a fervent Labour supporter all my life.
Lucy Heller, do you think that New Labour, this friend of business, is going to deliver anything of what you would really like to see happen?
I don't know. I await with interest. I think I'm fairly cynical about the process, and it's going to be very interesting to see. I think simply that it's such an untried quality as so far New Labour, it's difficult to tell. And I'm torn between a very deep cynicism and also an optimism that finally things could change. And certainly it's a day for celebration, just seeing the end of...
But we all know that these expectations about improving the health service, improving education and everything else cannot be accomplished except by increasing taxation in some form or other.
Well, I'm a happy supporter of tax increases, so I'm probably not in line with New Labour opinion on that. I hope that their majority will give them, and the strong support that's been given to the Liberal Democrats will give them some sort of mandate for exactly that sort of tax increase. I think if you want public services that are decent, you have to pay for them.
Terence Conran, you'd like to pay more tax, would you?
I wouldn't mind at all.
You can afford to, of course, is the thing, isn't it, at a personal level?
Yes, indeed.
But what about business taxes?
I think that business could equally be taxed a bit more without disincentivizing the entrepreneurial energy that there is in this country at the moment.
But surely in order to be a friend of business, you have to encourage the entrepreneurial spirit, don't you?
Yes, but it doesn't mean to say that you don't say to business, look, there is a price to pay for making this a better country.
You'd be happy to pay more tax, Chris, right?
I think you would be, as long as you felt the money was being spent on things which are important.
Well, you have no control over it. That's the nature of taxation, isn't it?
No, but that's the government's responsibility, and we obviously hope that the government will be responsible about putting funds into the places where it's needed.
So was it necessary for Tony Blair to make the commitment that the basic and top rates of income tax wouldn't rise?
Well, I think it's important that you don't take away the entrepreneurial spirit, and in fact that you develop even beyond what it is at the present moment. So, and tax should not be seen as being penal or a punishment. It should just be considered a payment in order to provide the infrastructure that the country needs.
Lucy, do you think it was a commitment he had to make?
I don't know, I'm torn. I think it's in some ways a pity that they put themselves into that straitjacket, but it may have been necessary simply to convince an electorate, who hadn't after all voted in the Tory government for, whatever it is, 20-something years. So, yeah, I think probably it was important in securing this victory.
Despite it means that you can't meet many of the commitments you'd like to meet.
Yeah, well, I hope they're going to be in for a long enough
All right.
time to...
Okay, we'll get back to you later. David.
Peter Kellner, what do you think the relationship between Blair and that sort of voice in business is going to be, and indeed his relationship with the left, who may be wanting him to tax more and do more
One of
fast?
the interesting things about this election, we've had a lot about Labour and business. We've had very little about Labour and the left, Labour and the trade unions. Now, the left wing and the trade unions have been as good as gold. They've kept silent, they've not been critical. And there's been a suggestion now, after the election, after Labour's victory, they'll start speaking out again, they'll start making trouble. I think with this majority, Tony Blair, if they do make trouble, will have no compunction about expelling left-wing MPs who start to rebel. He would have no trouble if he expelled 20 or 30, he'd still have a majority of more than 100. As for the unions, if they start to make trouble, again, I believe he'll have no compunction about severing Labour's formal links with the trade unions. After all, with this sort of majority, he could easily pass legislation to introduce state funding of political parties and therefore make the trade unions' residual role funding Labour irrelevant.
Thanks, Peter. Hugh Edwards is down at 10 Downing Street, where we're waiting for the Prime Minister to come out. Hugh, are you expecting that to happen pretty soon?
Yes, we are, David. We're expecting it to happen any second. We have been expecting it to happen any second. I understand that Mr. Major is about to come out. There's a slight problem, David, with the helicopter, because there are some worries in number 10 that Mr. Major's final statement here in Downing Street might be drowned out by noises from the helicopter that's flying above. So the understanding here is that once that gets out of the way, if it gets out of the way, and the noise goes, he will be in a position to come out and give a final conclusion to his 6.5 years in Downing Street. The car is ready to leave, as you can see, not Mr. Major's normal, familiar dark green Daimler, the familiar one we normally see him in. It's in fact one that's going to take him to the palace and then take him away. The gentleman just coming out of Downing Street there, Howell James, Mr. Major's special right-hand man, and Jonathan Haslam, his press secretary, they've just gone down to the pavement to stand to one side. That signals to me that Mr. Major is about to come out. As you can see, the Downing Street staff, all the windows open on the first and the second floor. The door opens, and I think we'll see now the last appearance of Mr. Major as Prime Minister in Downing Street. Here he is.
Good morning. I said most of what I wished to say when I had the opportunity of speaking last evening, but perhaps there are just one or two things that it would be appropriate to add this morning. It has been an immense privilege to serve as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom over the last 6.5 years. It's a privilege that comes to very few people, and it's a very precious privilege indeed. I hope as I leave Downing Street this morning that I can say with some accuracy that the country is in far better shape than it was when I entered Downing Street. The economy is booming, interest rates low, inflation low, unemployment falling, the growth pattern is well set, the health service is expanding, the education service is improving, and the crime statistics are falling. All of those, I think, are benevolent improvements in the interests of all the people of this country. I believe that the incoming government, to whom I repeat my warm congratulations upon their success, the incoming government will inherit the most benevolent set of economic statistics of any incoming government since before the First World War. I hope very much in the interest of the whole British nation that they're successful in retaining this economy in the future. If I may, I would like to clear up one area of speculation that I know has been abroad a little over the last few days. I have been a Member of Parliament for 18 years. I've been a member of the government for 14 years, a member of the Cabinet for 10 years, and Prime Minister since 1990. When the curtain falls, it's time to get off the stage, and that is what I propose to do. I shall therefore advise my parliamentary colleagues that I believe that it would be appropriate for them to consider the selection of a new leader of the Conservative Party to lead the party through opposition during the years that lie immediately ahead. This will necessarily take a little while to organise. Parliament must meet, and the members of Parliament must make their own consideration of this matter. Naturally, I shall remain at the service of the party during what I hope will be a reasonably brief interregnum. I'd just like, if I may, to add one final thought. During the 6.5 years that I have been in Downing Street, there have been innumerable personal kindnesses from huge numbers of people, many of whom I have never met and never heard from except by way of their individual kindness. I'd like to take this opportunity, if I may, of extending my thanks to them and the other millions of people in the British nation who've always given me their trust and the kindnesses to which I refer. I hope, if you will forgive me, I will say no more this morning. I believe, as you know, I have an appointment with Her Majesty the Queen in a few moments to tender my resignation so that a new government may then be formally appointed. I propose to see Her Majesty in just a few moments. The second reason I'll say no more now is that after that I hope that Norma and I will be able, with the children, to get to the Oval in time for lunch and for some cricket this afternoon. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
That must rank as one of the coolest last statements from a departing Prime Minister as he shakes hands with the police and he's going off this afternoon to watch the cricket, in tune with the way he's always publicly handled his politics. Very laid-back approach. And the Prime Minister shaking Brian Mawini's hand, the chairman of the Conservative Party having made it clear that he's going to stand down. When the curtain falls, one gets off the stage, using an appropriately theatrical image from his own family background, but staying there long enough for them, he hopes, in a reasonable time to consider the selection of a new leader of the opposition. And that is the end of a remarkable political career of a man who came from Brixton and Rutledge Grammar School, which he hated, and who was turned down for work as a bus conductor on the London buses, and was then promoted through the ranks, went through local council to the House of Commons, became a whip, and then became leader of his party, and for 6 years Prime Minister. He goes out into Whitehall as the tourists go past, and on his way down the Mall to Buckingham Palace to resign as Prime Minister and to move out of the centre stage of British politics. Now, Robin Oakley, you've watched this Prime Minister over all these years. This is a very abrupt ending, but a very dignified ending to a long period in office, isn't it?
These endings are always abrupt and pretty cruel in our style of politics. There's no transition period, really, for a departing Prime Minister in the British way of politics. It must have been a very hard moment indeed for Mr. Major, but carried off with his normal dignity and just that little bit of humour, perhaps, about going off to the Oval this afternoon. A little bit of jauntiness, just a little bit of style to go with it, I think.
And it looks as though there's no priority given to his car on the way down to Buckingham Palace. He seems to be caught in a traffic jam.
Well, that seems a little hard. You would have thought they could have prepared the way for him on an occasion like this.
How do you think his party will remember his period in office? There was a lot of sniping at him, of course, and maybe there'll be some more once this is over.
Well, I think perhaps history will be a little bit kinder to him than we have been through his period of office. I think when the Tories came to power in 1979, the question was the country governable? And in the latter years of John Major's time as Prime Minister, the question has been, is the Tory party governable? The whole coherence of the party seems to have been lost. People seem to have been more interested in winning arguments than winning elections. It's become an ideological party. Very difficult to manage a party like that when you have a small and dwindling majority, as John Major did. I think some people would take the generous view that he has held his party together longer than it was naturally bound to be so, and that he has in fact taken them through a difficult period, holding them together in a way that nobody else could.
The
But a lot of others...
the car is now turned down the Mall. They did clear the path finally, and you can see the police outriders at the front there. All the other cars pushed to one side, and he goes down the wrong side of the street, down the Mall towards Buckingham Palace to resign his office as Prime Minister. And he seems to be coinciding with the changing of the guard, with the household cavalry coming down as well and being pushed to one side, and the prime ministerial car coming down towards Buckingham Palace. And a former chairman of the party, Kenneth Baker, is watching these scenes. What does this bring to your mind?
The last day of Margaret Thatcher, when she went out from number 10. It's a very moving moment. It's very interesting that he's brought his children, whom very sensibly he's kept out of politics. And I hope Tony Blair will take the same attitude with his children. They should be protected from the pressures of life at the centre. But it's very interesting that right at the end he's brought them with him in this, what will be a historic and moving meeting with the Queen, really saying goodbye to his political life. And what he said in Downing Street before he left is a clear indication that he wants to step aside as soon as possible. And that means probably an election by the Tory backbenchers in June or July.
But she shed a tear when she got into her car and left number 10. He seemed very cool and off to watch the cricket this afternoon.
Yes, I wouldn't expect John to shed a tear. Many of you maybe thought Margaret wasn't going to like to shed a tear. But Margaret had been there much longer, and the way she went also had an effect upon her attitude.
Prime Minister's car then turns into the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, and he goes in there for that brief meeting that Jenny Bond described with the Queen, where there is no formality, though it's described as a formal ceremony. In fact, it's just a brief meeting at which he takes his farewell. And this is also being watched by Professor David Cannadine, who's an expert in these royal matters. David Cannadine, this is something that has been going on for centuries in this country, isn't it, that we're seeing here?
Yes, if you're a monarch, you take perhaps a different view of these proceedings than we do here, in that prime ministers come and go, and that's what being monarch in part is all about. If you've reigned as long as the present Queen, then it's she who is permanent, and these people, even Margaret Thatcher, tend to be rather ephemeral. Even 11 years from the perspective of the present Queen's reign isn't really all that long. She's been on the throne 45 years. She's about to see her 10th Prime Minister. That's as many as Queen Victoria saw in 63 years. They're all expendable for her.
All expendable. And this her youngest Prime Minister?
This is the first Prime Minister of whom it could be said that he is young enough to be her son. That is to say, Tony Blair. This is a real shift of generations. He's younger than her own eldest son, the Prince of Wales. This really does mark a move in a new direction, and it will point up the comparison between the Queen, the elderly, experienced matriarch, and this very young Prime Minister who will shortly be appearing.
I'm sure he may be slightly overawed when he arrives there, but do you think he'll be getting advice from the Queen? Do you think she'll act in a motherly way?
Well, she will certainly have a considerable amount of experience to pass on, and she will be able to tell him about politics in the 1950s and 60s when he was extremely young. She was, after all, Queen before he was even born. So that rather like Queen Victoria, as her reign unfolded, she will be able to say to him on occasions, I remember the precedents you've just cited, and it wasn't like that.
Well, we heard the Prime Minister say there that he is standing down. When the show's over, the curtain falls, you leave the stage. John Sopel is with two Tories down at Conservative Central Office for their reaction to the way John Major's put it and what it means.
Thank you, David. I'm joined by Damian Green, who is a newly elected Tory MP, but perhaps before that served with John Major in number 10 as part of his policy unit, and Steve Norris, who was Minister for Transport and was involved in the Tory campaign. Damian Green, what was your reaction to those words that he spoke?
It was entirely typical of him. It was low-key, it was subdued, and it was very English. And one forgets this about John Major. He does actually have a link to the people, and I use English particularly, not British, despite the slight irony of his passionate commitment to the Union, that only an Englishman would have wanted to leave number 10 talking about cricket.
Ken Baker made the point that the last time he saw this was when Margaret Thatcher left Number 10. I thought that what was striking about what John Major said was that sort of the area of hinterland that he clearly has. He still takes enormous pleasure from his family. He's got his cricket. You sense that there's a life for John Major outside of politics.
That's absolutely right. That he does. I mean, he's younger, so he's not sort of going into retirement in his dotage, and he's still got lots of things I'm sure he wants to do and will do. But also, that's right, politics is not the be-all and end-all. I'm sure he's feeling as churned up inside as Mrs. Thatcher was when she left, but he does know that there's a life outside.
Steve Norris, is it now time to start talking about the lessons of defeat, what needs to happen immediately? You're going to have a leadership election on you very soon. Is that the right thing?
I think in the event it probably is. I don't think anybody could have asked John to carry the burden any more than he has already done. He's suffered more pressure, I think, than any politician one can think of in recent memory, and he's borne it with extraordinary good humour. I mean, he's had an amazing campaign. He must be, apart from anything else, absolutely dog-tired.
John Redwood's written a piece for The Standard this evening. It looks, to all intents and purposes, like a personal manifesto.
It does. John, of course, has positioned himself very clearly outside the government. He managed to do that even during the election itself. I personally hope that we won't instantly fall either to recrimination or to the hustings. We ought to meet, the parliamentary party ought to now meet. It ought to get to know itself and then get to know all of the possible contenders who will succeed John Major before we come to any decision. I must say, if there's a choice between June and July, I hope they'll go for the later rather than the earlier date.
Damien Green, you've just stood in an election. It's your first brush with the British electorate. Do you think, and it's bound to be the debate that will come out in the leadership contest, that the party needs to adopt a more Eurosceptic stance, say no to a single currency, abandon the wait and see or negotiate and decide policy, however you want to characterise it?
Well, I think two things. First of all, the party mustn't become a single issue party, because that way lies madness and permanent defeat. But secondly, and more importantly, it has to say, what have the British people told us by electing a Labour government with a thumping majority? It's told us it wants to move a little bit to the left, and that was Tony Blair's achievement. Not too far, just a little bit to the left. And it seems to me a party that reacts to that by saying what we need to do is to move a long way to the right is not behaving very sensibly.
Steve Norris, very briefly.
Well, we have got to resolve this issue. Parties that divided do not win elections. If we didn't know that before, we sure as hell know it now.
Steve Norris, Damien Green, thank you very much. David.
Thank you, John. Children looking out of the window at Tony Blair's house in Richmond Way in Islington. Brief moment of posing for the pictures. We don't know whether they're going to go to Buckingham Palace. They're very smartly dressed up. Perhaps they are. Anyway, we'll follow that in a moment. We're waiting for John Major to come back from the palace, of course, and he'll be off. Well, we thought he was going off to Huntingdon, but it appears he's going off to the Oval for lunch and a spot of cricket this afternoon. I don't know who's playing. Do you know who's playing at the Oval this afternoon? Anybody know who's playing at the Oval? Yes. Jeremy, do you know who's playing at the Oval?
Roy Hattersley knows who's playing at the Oval.
We'll go to you and we'll hear from Roy Hattersley.
Thank you. Right, tell us.
It's a comment on my political future. You only asked a question when it's about cricket. that just shows how low I've sunk, doesn't it? It's Surrey versus the combined universities. So it's a pretty soft match for Surrey. It may be that just for once, John Major's on the winning side.
Well, this gives us a very good opportunity to talk about what it is like suddenly to lose office. I mean, what's the feeling?
Well, I think Shirley and I were both in the same cabinet, rather knew it was coming. So you prepare for it if you know it's coming. The 79 campaign was that famous campaign when Jim Callaghan told his assistant going round Parliament Square, the tide has turned, and nothing can save us. Shirley and I were actually at the last press conference together when Labour just edged ahead for the only time on the opinion polls, and the newspaper the following day said we're probably in with a chance. We knew we weren't. So having been prepared for it, it wasn't so bad when it came on the Thursday. Also, I don't know about Shirley, but I didn't believe it would last for very long. I went to say goodbye to my permanent secretary, Kent Lucas, and he said, I'm retiring in 2 years' time, so I'll be gone by the time you get back. And I said, get back? Oh, yes, you'll be back in 5 years, he said. Yeah. And I think many of us thought Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't be popular enough to survive more than one administration.
Shirley Williams.
Roy kept his seat, and I lost mine. And I was looking at Michael Portillo just then. I think the absolutely crucial thing is to wake up the next morning and think, what am I going to do now, and look forward to it. If you make politics your whole life, it's absolutely devastating if you lose your seat. And I remember thinking A New Life Begins. I was actually very excited by that thought. So the death which we saw poor John Major facing is something that passes fairly quickly, I think.
And there's a terrible irony in this, from my point of view at least. I think what saw me through the first 10 years of opposition was there was a job to do in the Labour Party. I wasn't wandering around thinking, how do I spend my political time until there's another election? I was doing my best to help Neil Kinnock turn the Labour Party around, and the battle in the Labour Party filled up the vacuum. And there's going to be a lot of Tories who now realise that they've got a lot of time and effort to spend on getting the party right. That'll help them through the difficulty.
The big thing is you have to adjust to opposition very quickly. You won't have the ministerial briefs, line to take minister, yes minister, no minister, all the rest of it. You've got to be on your own, make your own speeches. And the ones who can adapt to that most quickly will be the most effective. But, you know, losing office, there's a wonderful cartoon by Gilray in 1782, when North lost office and Fox came in for a very short time, and there are two pictures of them. Minister in, minister out. Minister in, Fox comes in, even his backside is being wiped by the servile, flattering civil servants. Poor old North, minister out, is having the chamber pots actually emptied over him. And it's really an ironic comment that power begets flattery and respect, absence of power is bypassed and neglected.
Thank you. David?
Peter Snow, let's have a look at the Liberal Democrats. We're going to hear from Paddy Ashdown in a moment and from Carolyn Quinn, but let's have a look at how they've done, can we, just as a reminder?
It has, for the Liberal Democrats, been their most successful night since the war. Just look at the target seats they were aiming at and how effective their fire on those targets has been. Something like 50 target seats all over the country, half of them, just over half of them, clustered across here in the south from St Ives, right the way across to Folkestone and Hythe, Michael Howard, the Home Secretary seat over here, and Colchester up there. So a great swathe of blue down here. The higher the block of blue, the more difficult for Liberal Democrats to catch that seat. One or two Labour seats targeted by the Liberal Democrats up in the north, but otherwise it is Conservative territory. Now, as we fly over those targets, watch how effective Paddy Ashdown's fire has been. Little box marked hits there, watch how many he hits and how many he misses. Starting with Folkestone and Hythe, the Home Secretary seat, not quite, that stays with the Tories. Isle of Wight goes down, along the south coast now, there's seats down, Taunton has gone, and there we go up into the Midlands. Huge, great Liberal Democrat piles. The Labour Party, of course, taking some of the Liberal Democrats' targets, as you'd expect, but there you are, that very mixed picture in the north, but in the south, the great success the Liberal Democrats have had here, missing only a very few Conservative seats like Folkestone and Hythe here, Eastbourne and Hastings and Rye, otherwise taking a very successful number of targets, 20 of the 27, which when you add to the other seats they've gained, like Harrogate and so on, and of course their existing parliamentary representation, they're doubling their representation in Parliament. Now, let's just have a look at the Liberal Democrat story over the years. You have to go back to Asquith in 1923 to see them with three-figure representation in Parliament. Lloyd George had 59 Liberal Democrat MPs in 1929. In 1931 it was down to 36. And then there was that long period in the wilderness when the Liberal Dems were down to sort of single figures, sometimes as low as 6. 23 Liberal Democrats in 1983. And then in 1992, a disappointing year for Paddy Ashdown with just 18 Liberal Democrats, and there he is now at 45. It's back to the times of the 30s for Paddy Ashdown.
And Ray Mickey, the news has just come through, has held Argyll and Bute with an increased majority, and the Scottish National Party goes very slightly down. The Tories down 8% in Argyll and Bute. Now, Paddy Ashdown spoke earlier about John Major and his defeat, and this is what he said.
On that? Well, I doubt if the interregnum will be brief. I think the civil war, which we've already seen running virulently in the Conservative Party, will now break out in earnest, and I think it will disable the Conservative Party in much the same way as Labour was disabled in the early 1980s for some considerable time to come. Somebody is bleeping. It's not Mr. Matthew Amroliwala, so it must be who it normally is. And I believe you'll see a replay of that. How the Conservative Party will emerge from that after a period of time, I don't know, but the Conservatives as a force, in my view, will now be disabled for some time to come. As for Mr. Major, I believe he has fought an honourable and determined campaign, an almost lonely campaign. No one who has watched it can other but admire his determination and his personal courage. It has been a remarkable sight, and one which I think those who know Mr. Major will have felt for him as he had to go through. He is a decent and honourable man leading a terrible party. And I don't think anybody can look back at his premiership which has been marked by an extraordinary resilience and courage in some areas, and not wish him well for the future.
Generous words from Paddy Ashdown, to a man who was quite sharp about him in the last House of Commons. Carolyn Quinn is at Liberal Democrat headquarters. Carolyn, good morning.
Good morning. Yes, well, Paddy Ashdown has just hosted a very brief press conference, it has to be said, because the message is very much the same as after the results were coming through last night. Basically, the best Liberal Democrat force in Parliament since 1929, as you were seeing on your graphics there, since the days of Lloyd George. 44 seats, it looks like, for the Liberal Democrats at the moment, possibly going up to 46 after they've all declared. Now, Paddy Ashdown, I asked him if he regarded himself still as an opposition party, and he said we will be one of the opposition parties, but working with Labour when we can on things like devolution and constitutional reform, but being an opposition when necessary. So I think he's trying to sort of straddle two things at the same time, but it certainly seems that there is a great willingness there to work with Labour when it's possible.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. Let's join Jeremy Paxman.
David, yes. Now, Shelley Williams, give us your version of what's happened with this very, very significant change in the Liberal Democrat representation.
I think that what we've seen is 2/3 of the people of this country voting for constitutional reform. I think we will see this as the last Parliament, or maybe the last but one Parliament, to be elected by first past the post. I think the Liberal Democrats, with their double representation, are going to be a major force for a very, very great change in British politics.
But why should this be the last first past the post election, given that Tony Blair's got the vast majority he has and doesn't need, he may not even need to honour the promise he's made about a referendum?
But I think he will honour the promises he's made, because I think there's a lot of power and strength in the Labour Party for those constitutional reforms. You can't make those constitutional reforms without completing the package. And I think we're going to see PR for the European elections and PR for the Scottish and Welsh Parliament.
The other interesting thing that's happened is that, in a way, I suppose, people have willy-nilly discovered proportional representation.
Yes, by tactical voting. You're absolutely right. Tactical voting shows, I think, that the British public has had enough of wholly unrepresentative politics. I mean, even today, the Labour Party's great sweep is based upon a popular vote not much bigger than John Major's was in 1992. It's still very, very misleading and unrepresentative, and I think that the tactical voting has been the nearest the British people could get to actually representing the way they feel about the outcomes of elections.
I bet you wish you'd learned that when you were in the SDP Alliance.
Well, wouldn't that have been nice? But you know, I'm very happy about that, Jeremy. I think the SDP Liberal Alliance are the fathers and mothers, if you like, of the Liberal Democrats, and I've always thought we'd break through, and I think we're beginning to.
And of New Labour in some respects.
Yes, in some ways, New Labour too. New Labour in many ways is the SDP moved a little bit to the right.
Shelley Williams, thank you. David.
Well, David Cannadine, a professor at Columbia University who specialises in written about the monarchy, is here watching the scenes down at Buckingham Palace. Behind us on the screen there, where John Major is with the Queen. Tell us a bit about the constitutional nature of what's going on this morning.
Well, it's a curious amalgam of the decorative and the substantial. Tony Blair will become Prime Minister essentially because the electorate has voted for him. But on the other hand, he can only, in fact, become Prime Minister because the Queen appoints him. And so, in one sense, the visit to the palace is not what it's about, because what it's about is the democratic election. On the other hand, the visit to the palace is very much what it's about, because without that visit, he couldn't become Prime Minister. Only the Queen, as head of state, can appoint the head of government, and that, of course, is what she will do.
And she's had a clear-cut result here. There's nothing at issue, but it could have been, if it had been a hung parliament, for instance, that her decision would have been important.
Well, various people get very excited about the prospects of hung parliaments just before every election, but on the whole, there haven't been very many of them, and I suspect that the rules and procedures are rather well worked out, so that even if there were a hung parliament, I don't think it would be very difficult for her to know what to do. But of course, in this particular instance, that's entirely academic. It's absolutely clear what she does. She has only one choice.
There are crowds gathering in Downing Street, children waving flags up there behind us as we watch. And the next arrival at Downing Street will be Tony Blair. And at Buckingham Palace, we haven't seen the departure of John Major yet, so he's been there half an hour or so. How has this relationship changed, David, over the Queen's reign? And is it a constantly evolving relationship between monarch and Prime Minister and the Constitution?
I don't think there's much evidence that it's changed in the present Queen's reign, certainly in terms of changes of Prime Minister at election time. I suppose there have been changes when the Conservatives have been in power and Prime Ministers have resigned and then new Prime Ministers have come along. In the old days, the early part of her reign, Conservative Prime Ministers emerged. One thinks here in particular of Douglas Home after Macmillan, whereas of course in more recent times, as with John Major himself, they're elected, and therefore the scope or danger, it could be said, of the monarch involving itself in the choice of a Prime Minister in that context has much lessened. So I suppose there's been a change there, but that of course is not what we're talking about today.
But without this part of the Constitution, there would, in your view, be no legitimacy. I mean, you do need some part of the Constitution that effectively anoints a new Prime Minister. You can't just have an election and choose one and
That's right.
go ahead.
The election is, there can be no Prime Minister without an election, but there can also be no Prime Minister without a trip to the palace to see the Queen.
Tony King, yes.
I think it's worth pointing out that there's no inaugural ceremony as you have in the United States. There's no occasion when the Prime Minister emerges to make a formal statement. It's also, in contrast to the United States, worth pointing out that, as somebody said earlier in the program, there is no transition period at all. Consider the fact that Tony Blair has been fighting a 6-week election campaign without any intermission whatsoever. He's been on the go 12, 14 hours a day, traveling the country, making speeches. He must, even if he has the constitution of an ox, be dog-tired by now. You could argue there's something a little bit unfortunate about a system that takes a person in that condition, however elated, and suddenly puts him in number 10 Downing Street in charge of the country.
We're joined now by Paddy Ashdown, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Good morning, just still good morning, Mr. Ashdown. Thank you for joining us again.
But a very good good morning, David.
You spoke generously about the Prime Minister. He's always been rather harsh about you in the House of Commons.
Oh, we're always harsh in the House of Commons. Perhaps we should be less so in future. Perhaps we can establish a new style of politics in which we don't have to go through that charade. But John Major and I have a very cordial personal relationship. I found him a very, very decent and honourable man to deal with. He's been our Prime Minister for 7 years. There has to be a tinge of sadness about this. He is a decent and honourable man leading what has become a truly dreadful party, and he's done his best with it.
You had a rather rough time during the last Parliament as the Liberal Democrats, and when you spoke there were all around you Labour left-wingers booing at you and people generally trying to knock you off your point. Do you think it'll be different now in this new House of Commons, with the Tories reduced as they are, with you with many more MPs?
I really don't know, David. That depends on the House of Commons, and you won't be able to know its character and its mettle until it meets. But I do speculate, interestingly, on the thought that if John Major follows tradition, he will sit in the traditional position of ex-prime ministers, which means that he will occupy the position of Dennis Skinner, entirely below me. I suspect it'll be slightly different.
And what have you got any firmer idea now, halfway through this morning, of what kind of relationship? We heard Peter Mandelson, I don't know whether you heard him earlier on this morning, talking about, in fairly general terms, about a new kind of relationship between the Liberal Democrats and Labour. Do you have any idea, or have you had any contacts with Labour at all today about what they're thinking of?
No, I have not the first idea, but I do know this, that about after the 1992 election, I gave a speech in which I said, let's see if we can find a new style of politics, a more cooperative, partnership-based style of politics, where parties that are different and offer different choices to the electorate, as they did last night, can nevertheless work together where they agree and where it's in the nation's interest. You know, just referring to John Major for a moment, when I used to stand up in the House of Commons and dare to congratulate him on something good that he had done, I was actually booed more loudly by the Conservatives than if I'd criticised him. Well, we can get away from that, and if Mr. Blair wants to find a means to get away from the destructive tribalism that has done so much damage to our British politics, well, I've been in favour of that for 5 years, and we will be ready partners in that process.
I know you'd be the first to tell us here on this programme if you'd been offered a cabinet post, Mr. Ashdown. Anything like that happened?
Certainly not, David. Mr. Blair is exceedingly busy. He has a vast majority, which he's won. It's a personal triumph for him. He carries with him my good wishes, and I'm sure the good wishes of the nation. He's got a very big task ahead of him. We will be a constructive and effective political force. We have got elected on a vastly increased number of members of Parliament. We have behind us votes of many people who now expect us to represent in the next Parliament the things we've represented in this election, and we'll do that. Investment in education, tackling the crisis in the health service, beginning to clean up the mess of our politics, and we'll be a force to bring that about. This is now the largest Liberal or Liberal Democrat force that we have had since the days of Lloyd George, and in the next Parliament, when the really great issues, the issues of Europe and the issues of constitutional change, will divide both other parties, the Liberal Democrats, as now a powerful and united force, have got a big role to play, and I intend to ensure they play it.
Mr. Ashdown, thank you very much indeed. Well, now, down at Buckingham Palace, crowds gathering. Jenny Bond is down there. Jenny, I'm not quite clear whether they've come for changing the guard or to see changing the Prime Minister today.
Yes, David, well, I think an awful lot of them actually are tourists who've turned up to see changing the guard, which is going on regardless of the other events. But they've had this wonderful bonus now of finding they are witnessing a moment of history. There's a great sense of occasion here, a great sense of colour. Mr. Major's been in there, for some 25 minutes now. He's up on the first floor of the palace in the northwest corner. It's a very comfortable room, the Queen's audience room, where, of course, he's met her on many occasions in the past, on Tuesday evenings with his audience to the Queen. So he'll feel at ease there, and I'm told that at the end of their private audience, just the two of them in there, of course, it's quite likely that Mrs. Major will go in to say her farewells as well.
I think many of the American visitors would be very surprised that we don't do something rather more pompous on changing Prime Ministers than this. They're used to whole days of presidential parades given over for a change of the presidency.
Indeed, it's quite remarkable, the informality, really. I'm told there's no set form of words that Mr. Major would be expected to use, or the Queen. He will simply have, by now, offered his resignation verbally, and she will have accepted it. There are no seals of office, for example. All the Prime Minister has are letters patent, as they're called. These are lengthy and formal documents, which in fact appoint him not as Prime Minister, but as First Lord of the Treasury. And those letters don't have to be given back or anything, because they are automatically revoked by the letters patent for the new Prime Minister, which will be drawn up, I believe, in the next few hours for Mr. Blair.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Well, now our helicopter is whirring over Islington at the moment, causing its disturbance there. Previously it was interrupting the Prime Minister at number 10 Downing Street, looking out over Tony Blair's house in that green-fringed street, exchanging number 1 for number 10. He'll be leaving from here and going to the palace a bit later on. So we'll be covering all that, so stay with us. And in the meantime, we join Jeremy Paxman. Jeremy.
Neil Kinnock, do you think that, as is being suggested, this is a terribly brutal way to change office?
It is brutal, but I think it's entirely proper that we do it like this. I'd hate to see us moving towards an American or a French system of great pomp and circumstance and bands marching past and a flyover by the Royal Air Force and the pause in between, an interregnum that's unnecessary. It's much better that we do it in a very orderly way and a very ordinary way as it's being done now. It'll be painful for John Major, but he understands the rules of the game, and he made that very clear with that statement, very accurate statement, about when the curtain comes down, it's time to leave the stage. That's exactly how it should be seen.
And you don't think that the suddenness with which it takes place and the exhausted condition in which someone is expected to assume office are neither of them desirable?
Well, I don't mean to be brutal really, but politics is a blood sport. The prizes are big, and you lose a lot when you don't win, and that's understood by all the grown-up players in the game.
Neil Kinnock, thank you.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Well, I'm joined here by the last Labour Prime Minister, Lord Callaghan, who came into office, didn't fight an election as Prime Minister, except to lose it. But you did come into office abruptly. What do you think is going through Tony Blair's mind as he, without any experience at all, you were quite experienced in politics when you went in, is about to form a new administration?
Well, he's shown such maturity, I think, and grasp of the whole situation that I have little doubt about his worries. And I don't think he will be particularly concerned in that sense of whether he can handle the situation. What I am sure he feels, as I guess every new Prime Minister feels, I remember I felt it, I left my officials at the door of the Cabinet room, and I walked in and by myself, and they shut the door, and I stood by the Prime Minister's chair, and I felt then, and this may sound sententious, but it's absolutely true, I felt I was a trustee of all that was best in Britain's history and a leader for the few years that were going to be given to me. And it was a solemn moment in that sense, and I sat down, and there was a white telephone there then that was supposed to connect me directly with Moscow for the nuclear deterrent. I see that's disappeared now, I'm glad to say. And I rang the bell, and then the business started. You see, number 10 is not a home. It's an office with just a flat on top. It's basically an office, and that is why all the brutality of the sudden ins and outs has got to take place.
And what would your advice be to him in general? I don't mean about his administration or his policies, but in general about handling the civil servants and all the pressures that he'll suddenly find himself under, quite different. I mean, however great the pressures of reorganising the Labour Party, and goodness knows they must have been quite severe, this is something altogether different.
I'm not sure the pressures are going to be as great as all that, you know. I felt in some ways that being Prime Minister was easier than being, for example, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Because you have your own people, and provided you let them get on with the job, they do get on with it. But as to how you should handle it, I think we should destroy what has been suggested many times, that the civil service will try to carry him in some direction. Tony Blair has shown himself determined enough and bold enough and clear enough, and provided he tells Robin Butler and the rest of them what he wants to do, they will carry it through.